All right. Well, welcome back to Hebrew Tools, and this is the follow-up to the what I believe to be the miracle of the rebirth of the Hebrew language. These are the lecture notes, 4 pages, on the bridges into the Hebrew language. It's sort of the oddities of Hebrew. There is literally no way to teach hermeneutics in a semester or even in a 8-week quarter, for goodness sakes. One of the books that I uploaded into Dropbox for you is 500 pages, and it's just on oddities and idioms, metaphors. You just can't summarize a language that quickly, that easily, especially when a language like Hebrew died for over 1,800 years and then came back to life. There's still a language council in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. And there's still tweaks that they make. But again, I'm going to ask you to look at the notes. They're the ones that have on the front of the page on Yehud, Eliezer Yehud. But we're going to start on page 2. These are the bridges. There's basically 5 periods of the Hebrew language. Only reason I'm telling you this is because it might help understand some of the word differences. For instance, the differences between Isaiah and say Daniel. Well, you're talking about almost 300 years of a difference and different type of language. So we start with biblical Hebrew. They enter into the promised land under Joshua, 1440 years. You know, when they go in and they go in this way, then they go north, and they go south. I believe that's the order. When they get into the Holy Land, Hebrew becomes established as the language. It's a Semitic tongue, a Middle Semitic tongue. And it's quickly established as the national language. Look at point 2 under A. Hebrew remains in common usage even when they are in the Babylonian exile, even when they are in Babylon. As you know, the periods of Old Testament history, you got the Egyptian captivity, then you have the Assyrian captivity, then you have the Babylonian captivity. Egyptian captivity ends when Moses says, "Let my people go." And then the Assyrian captivity, the Assyrians coming from the north, they take the 10 northern tribes. That's the days of Isaiah, a few of them around his time, Amos, Hosea as well, Jonah. Then we have of course, the Assyrians lose to the Babylonians, right? And Babylonians lose to the Persians. But when the Babylonians take the southern 2 tribes captive, they take them in 3 times, and they, by the way, return in 3 waves. When the Persians just say, we have no use for you. So if you'll notice the notes, I said, even during the Babylonian exile, 1,500 years, and all the way through the days of Jesus, until about 400 AD, quite frankly, when Jerusalem is destroyed, the story of Titus, not the biblical Titus, but the emperor and the general, when the temple is destroyed, when the second temple is destroyed, they become diaspora. And the Hebrew language, while clinging to it, and some written, of course, the Essene community made sure that in the scriptoriums, the Hebrew language, became very frail. It became very, it was only passed on by the liturgy, by the written word. By the religious texts, like the Torah, the Midrash, and the Talmud. The second period is that period of time, the Midrash. Here's the question. The Midrash, by the way, is the scholars, the rabbis, the teachers. They still had the religious schools wherever the Jews were congregated, wherever they were living, and they would teach in Hebrew. But here's the interesting question, because it applies to how you approach the Old Testament scripture. How do you have a sacrificial system when you have no place to sacrifice, when you have no temple for Yom Kippur, or for all the smaller and the temporary? Where do you go if you have no place for the festivals and feasts that are listed in Leviticus? So they develop slowly over the course of time under the leadership of some really very important Hebrew people in history, but Maimonides is one of them. They develop a 613 rules to salvation. And it comes from the religious texts, not just the Tanakh, the law, the prophet, the writings, but also the commentaries on those, and the prayer books, and the Midrash, which are sermons on the commentaries. The main thing, however, is they maintained Hebrew, even though they didn't have a Holy Land, they didn't have a temple. Please note, here's when we find new words and idioms that are added to the language. 3, Middle Ages. Around the time of Y1K, 1000 AD, there's a revival of Hebrew in Jewish communities where they would have grammar schools. And it's strong. I love this because it was before the Renaissance, if you think about it. It was a period of teaching the children the language of their fathers and the language of their people and the language of their holy book. And please notice the very first Hebrew-Arabic dictionary, called the Collected Meanings, is in the 10th century, a Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic dictionary by David ben Abraham al-Fassi. Handwritten. A polyglot, 3-language dictionary. Fascinating and excruciatingly strong in detail. Please notice also, during the golden age of Jewish culture in Spain, the Sephardic Jews, Hebrew poetry written by gifted Jewish poets even enriched the language more. But it was, for the common man, it was the spoken tongue, not the written tongue. Not everybody had the time or the money to go to the academy or to go to the training. The synagogues, those very small, and in some places they were hunted. They did their best to keep the language going, and they did their best to keep it written as well. In the Renaissance, you cannot overemphasize Gutenberg Press. You cannot overemphasize the fact that the first Hebrew printing press in the Holy Land was 1577, and that's when they print the first Hebrew Tanakh, law, prophet writings. The first Yiddish, Hebrew, Latin, and German dictionaries published in 1542 in movable type. Now, finally, the rebirth that I spoke about in the last lecture, modern Hebrew. I mean, it's only been going literally for 150 years, 140 years. It's less than 150 years. But under the labor of the Jewish Language Council and the work of Yehud and the schools and the scholars, they've added 75,000 words. But very specifically, 2,400 that were designed for a recent language. For instance, a moving vehicle. There's no word for that in the Hebrew, but they would find a way, movement, so that it would be translated. You'll notice in the box at the bottom of page 2 that there's 2 important books that we often take for granted. The first one is Strong's Concordance. When he put this together, which was 1890, he indexed every word in the Old Testament. And he came up, in the King James Bible, of course, and he came up with 8,674 Hebrew roots, stems. This was monumental. If you could imagine the time that this would take. I have heard in recent days that there are men that, in their older days, they decide they're going to handwrite the Bible to keep their brain fresh and to keep themselves going. You just imagine how much time that takes and how labor intensive it is. 8,674 roots that Strong put into his book. And we take it for granted because it seems to be one of the first books we buy. It's that important. The second one is what we call BDB, which is Brown, Driver, and Briggs. In 1906, it used a lot of the work that Yehud did, and it was the premier Hebrew to English lexicon. I've used it in class. I used it under Dr. Dunstan when I first started studying Hebrew in college back in 1984, and it remains to this day. So if you'll turn to the third page, I want to start just some quick points about the basics of the Hebrew language. Hebrew is a little bit different. We have 28 letters in the English language. You have 22 consonants in Hebrew. And there's 5 of them that change their sound based on if they're at the middle or at the end of a sentence or an end of a word. And that's important mainly because Hebrew doesn't have vowels, not the way we think of vowels. Vowels were added later. I don't get ahead of yourself. The second thing I don't want to get ahead of myself, The second thing I want to look at is pronunciation, which is phonology, linguistics. It's what I did the work at the Summer Institute, and it's what I love doing. The lack in Hebrew because they don't have vowels, vowels are in the Hebrew dots around the letters. And so you have like seen and sheen. It looks like a W, and there's a dot over the first part of it, or a little dot over the last part of it. It changes the pronunciation. It's where we say sibilut versus shibilut, if you remember the big controversy in the book of Judges. That's over that letter, the seen or sheen. It's the difference in English like between ship and sheep, or bit and beat. If you ever speak to a Hebrew native speaker, somebody who has learned English after they have Hebrew, you'll notice they have a problem with the th sound, the theta. Like think, they'll say tink or tink. They also have the same problem with clothes, then. And notice also the difference between the W and the V. So they'll say the weather, they'll say the veather, or they'll say worship instead of worship. Also, a last little hint. If you ever meet somebody who is Jewish and they learned Hebrew first and then they learned English, in Hebrew they always pronounce either the last consonant or the next to last, penultimate consonant of the word. And so their pronunciation, their accents are a little bit different. Don't be too harsh on them, because look in English. You have the word like though, T-H-O-U-G-H. You add an R and it's through. You add another O and it's thorough. And it changes the pronunciation of the word too. If you look at the bridges over time, morphology, which is really what I like to emphasize, it's what I do with, as we did with Sila and Shibalot. Morphology is the study of how words fit together. In Hebrew, it's basically 3 parts to every word, beginning, middle, and end of every word. Suffix, prefix, like that. Interestingly, I say this because it's interesting. The Masoretic text was the first text. You're talking about somewhere Middle Ages, 600 to 1000, when vowels were added. And not just vowels, but the cantillation marks, which are the accents, where you put the accent on a word. And also, interestingly, because Hebrew doesn't have an indefinite article, the difference between a word or word, you'll often hear them say things like, I have house, I have dog. They just don't give the indefinite article. I have a dog instead of the dog. You can skip over the sentence word order only because modern Hebrew has shifted. It's changed. In English, of course, we go with subject, verb, object. I ran to him, okay? Or I saw the car. Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, is flipped a little bit. Biblical Hebrew goes verb, then the subject, and then the object. So Hebrew is a verb-driven language. Biblical Hebrew is a verb-driven language. So a sentence like Dibir Ha'ish el Moshe, about Moses, we would translate it, the man spoke to Moses. The man spoke to Moses. The man, subject, spoke, the verb, to Moses, the object. But in Hebrew, if you were going to do a word-for-word transliteration of it, spoke the man to Moses. Spoke. Now you think about that. When you come to a sentence that's got some passion and some pulse to it, it's because the verb drives the sentence in the Hebrew. And it brings me to the last page, page number 4. Only because I only make this comparison because we have only 2 basic tenses in Hebrew. I spent so much time nifal, hitpail, these various forms of words, nouns and verbs. However, all Hebrew has is a perfect tense or an imperfect tense. He ate, or he was trying to eat. And to put it into the present tense, they add a gerund. They add the ing, like you heard me say. He tried to eat versus he is trying to eat. Whereas English, if you'll notice, we have 8. As hard as it looks that Hebrew is not that difficult. It certainly looks different because it reads from right to left. So to the English reader, you're picking up the last page to start a book. And that the letters look different. They look Arabic. They look Hebrew. They look like scratches. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Daled, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, all the Hebrew letters. But it's actually a pretty simplified tongue. And it had to be. It had to be because the story of the Old Testament is the story of a people hunted, hated, and sometimes not holy. And thus, they wandered in the desert. It's a walking people. There was a tabernacle before there was a temple because they just didn't pay attention. And then when they had the temple, they lost the temple. And so it's the story of the comeback, or at least the attempt. Talk to you next week.